Hi everyone, it's William with the 1921 Grand Duke Dmitri Diary series. We're still on the long entry for the 15th of March, 1921. We've been immersed in some sensitive material with respect to the right wing of the Russian emigration and its flirtation with fascism and also with Nazism. In a few cases, it became more than a flirtation with various individuals. But anyway, views have dropped off a bit, so I hope it's not because of this. I hope we're all committed to an accurate historical account, and I will stick my neck out and say that I think if Dmitri himself knew about this journey that we're on with him, that he would want it to be a complete one and not one where he was portrayed either as a vacuous playboy, as he often has been, or as some kind of saint, as many of the Romanovs are. I'm not talking about in their religious aspect, as Grand Duchess Elizabeth is acknowledged as a saint, and then many other members of the imperial family are acknowledged as martyrs. So that's not what I'm talking about, but the idea that certain Romanovs never put a wrong foot forward. I don't think anybody thinks that about Dmitri, but yeah, I mean, if they did, I don't think he would want them to. But of course, I can't speak for him. I can say that in my discussions with his son, Prince Paul Ilinsky, we did talk about some of these sensitive issues, and Paul never once asked me not to present them in a biography or in any other work. He was not that kind of person, and I don't think Dmitri was either. So anyway, having said all that, I just today bought a new book. It's not actually not a new book, but a book that I've been meaning to buy for years, but it started out as a PhD dissertation by a scholar in I think at UCLA, I'm not sure. And here I've written down the title of it, and I haven't written down his name, which is utterly stupid, and so I'll have to post that. But the name of the book is The Russian Roots of Nazism, White Emigres and the Making of National Socialism, 1917 to 1945. And yeah, it's been out for a while, but I had to pay more than $50 for it, so I'm not that pleased. But on the other hand, that's not a bad price for a scholarly work. They tend to be horrifically expensive. Meanwhile, I'm using a lot from these sources: Walter Lecour's Russia and Germany, A Century of Conflict, and Alexander Zhivakov's Les Russes Blancs. And so far, these two works really are in full agreement with each other. One from 65, one from, I think, 2000 and when 2000. I mean, so there's a lot of time that passed between these two very different researchers, who one German Jewish and American and one French, and 2007, and a descendant of white Russian emigres. And so yeah, for the moment, that is primarily what I'm working with. Also, another book that unfortunately I've only seen excerpts from. A friend of mine who owns a copy was kind enough to send me excerpts from it about Dmitri. And this was Georges Graf, who ended up being the head of Grand Duke Kirill's chancellery when Kirill sort of crossed the Rubicon and declared himself the emperor in exile. Graf took that role. Graf knew Dmitri very well, and he wrote a book called, the French title is Au service de la Maison Impériale de Russie. So in service of the Russian Imperial House, 1917 to 1941. And I'm going to try my best to obtain that, and it's something that's quoted by both these other authors, since Graf was on the scene in person and wrote about these things. Okay, so, at this time in the 1920s, between the wars, in the early 1920s, and, on into the 30s to a certain extent, there was fascism as a fad, as something that people were looking at. It was new and thinking, well, I mean, not new in the sense of these sort of nationalist tendencies had been around for a long time. And so there were some people who just kind of were fascinated by it, and then for a while, and thought, oh, maybe this is a good counterweight to communism and to Bolshevism. But there were other people, of course, who were just sort of dyed-in-the-wool fascist, authoritarian, nationalist types by conviction. And these two people that Dmitri is meeting with on his trip to Berlin, one of them, Markov II, that we talked about in the last diary entry, was definitely one of these who was a fascist by conviction, even before fascism was called fascism. The other one, who is just as sinister as Markov II, and maybe even a little more. Apparently there's some doubt about whether he had any convictions or at all, or whether he wasn't just sort of a classic psychopath. Okay, so in this, to recap the last diary entry, Dmitri had met with Markov, and Markov had told him that, well, Dmitri came away with the conclusion that Markov had changed, that he'd learned his lesson during the revolution, that he'd become, in Dmitri's words, more liberal. And I think Markov was probably deliberately trying to make that impression on Dmitri, who was not an extremist, like Markov was. Okay, so let's go finally into Dmitri's own words. He's talking about, so we've just finished his meeting with Markov, and yeah, here we go. And then, in addition to Markov II's group, there's something incomprehensibly vague, a creation from the efforts and imagination of Biskupsky. The name alone, of course, had already inspired distrust in me, but he takes himself terribly seriously and believes that he will be the one to carry out the real revolution in Russia. What's just imagination and what is fact, that's very difficult to say. But Biskupsky painted amazing pictures for me of the White International, which would include Germany, or more accurately, its monarchist currents, Hungary, which is entirely monarchist-minded, and with Admiral Horthy at its head, carefully guards the crown of Saint Stefan. And Biskupsky is thinking of including parts of the East in this White International, and is flirting with the idea of approaching Kemal, the leader of the Turkish nationalists. Biskupsky claims that he is personally in touch with all the leaders of the monarchist movements in Western Europe, and that he has money and supposedly is financed by some Hungarian-German banks. In addition to all that, he claims he is fully informed about the mood in the Soviet state and has established contact with the Red Army. In short, if even 3/4 of what Biskupsky says is true, then it's astonishing. He even assured me that his union is so strong and serious that Markov II is prepared to accept Biskupsky's leadership, along with his entire party. His only condition is that he receive 300,000 marks a month to cover the party's expenses. Biskupsky confirms that this money will be provided in a timely manner. So all very, very interesting. Dmitri clearly is extremely skeptical about this. Biskupsky's reputation has preceded him, and I don't know when Dmitri says that the name itself already has filled him with distrust. Obviously, he's heard bad things about Biskupsky, but he doesn't tell us where he heard them from. Okay, two other people are mentioned. Miklos Horthy, who was at that time the so-called regent of Hungary, so basically the president of Hungary, I think beginning in 1918 or 1919. So after the Habsburg dynasty had fallen, ostensibly Horthy was there as the regent in place of Charles I of Austria temporarily, but Horthy turned out not to want Charles to come back and thwarted Charles's two efforts to come back. So when Dmitri says that he is carefully guarding the crown of Saint Stefan and that Hungary is entirely monarchist in outlook, then clearly Dmitri is wrong. Okay, Kemal Ataturk, I won't go into any detail about him. I don't know much about him. He was the president of Turkey beginning in 1923, so not quite yet, and he would, of course, be the famous modernizer, intent upon building a modern secular Turkish republic. All right, so let's talk about Biskupsky. This is Major General Vasily Viktorovich. He was in his 40s at this time and was supposedly a very wealthy man who had sold land, specifically with oil fields or oil interests, to Japan, land in the Far East. And whether this is true or not, I don't know. And Dmitri mentions this, saying, with some skepticism, of course, that he claims to have money that can, and also be working with Hungarian German banks who can finance this grand political group of his that's just going to swallow up Markov's group. Okay, let's see. Biskupsky was a close associate of Kirill's. I can't say when that began or when it ended. So Zhivakov says in quotes that Biskupsky was called Kirill's Grand Vizier, however you say it, and Lacour says that he was, also in quotes, that he was Kirill's prime minister and also the self-proclaimed guardian of Kirill was the self-proclaimed guardian of the imperial throne, in the words of Lacour, and Biskupsky was his prime minister. So a lot of this that I'll be talking about actually hadn't happened yet in 1921 when Dmitri met with Biskupsky. Biskupsky would be at the Reichenhall conference along with Markov. They had independent organizations, but this Reichenhall conference came about. There was an organization called Aufbau that was founded by Scheubner Richter, a Baltic German refugee after the revolution who settled in Germany. And he, according to Lacour, was engaged in the uphill task of trying to unite this right-wing Russian immigration into one effective political organization that would join forces with the German right, in particular the Hitler movement, in the struggle for a new Russia. Aufbau was described as a political economic association, although it was really a front organization for these right-wing groups. So, yeah, to put this in perspective, again, we'd already had something called the Kapp Putsch in 1920, where there was an attempt to overthrow the Weimar government in Germany. And there would then be the famous Beer Hall Putsch in 1923, where Hitler launched this failed effort to take over in Bavaria and in all of Germany. So we are in the middle of those two. We're in 1921 with the Reichenhall Conference to come in just a few months' time. We're in March, and it will occur in May. And I want to read some text from Lacour. He has a whole little subsection about Vasily Biskupsky. So what does he say on Biskupsky? He had been known in Russia as an able officer and even better gambler. At the time of the revolution, he was in command of the 3rd Army Corps in Odessa. After the evacuation of the Ukraine by the White forces, he had found his way to Berlin, and following the Kapp Putsch, in which he appeared on the sidelines, he settled in Munich, then the Mecca of all right-wingers. He had known Ludendorff and Colonel Bauer, who regarded him as the most capable and reliable leader of the Russian émigrés. In Munich, he set out to find more allies in the struggle against Bolshevism, and a friend subsequently described how they discovered Hitler one evening at a meeting in a Munich inn. But we'll go further with that later. This is after his meeting with Dmitri in 1921. According to some who knew him well, Biskupsky, a man of considerable cunning, was a schemer in the grand style, always engaged in some major financial or political intrigue. He pretended to have believed in the nefarious influence of the hidden hand, the Jews, Freemasons, Jesuits, and other sinister international forces since the outbreak of the First World War, but at least one witness maintains that Biskupsky was far too intelligent for this and was merely pretending to accept the basic articles of faith of the right-wing monarchist circles. According to the same source, Biskupsky cared no more about the fate of Russia than the future of Abyssinia. He was interested in the excitement and the spoils of politics, not in ideology. This may be an exaggeration, but it is certainly true that Biskupsky loved to plot and to scheme, mostly from behind the scenes, playing one Grand Duke against another in their ambitions for the throne. So we don't know who this anonymous source was. I don't think Biskupsky could have occupied himself too much with pitting one Grand Duke against another, because that really just wasn't a thing. Dmitri and Kirill were rivals for a very short period of time. Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich simply wanted to be acknowledged as the senior member of the imperial family, who had a good head on his shoulders and was, not a partisan political type. But anyway, that's an interesting notion. So, in reference to what Dmitri says about this promise that Biskupsky makes, or not a promise to Dmitri, but he says, well, Markov's whole organization, his whole party is going to come over and join me because I'm going to provide them with 300,000 marks a month for the party's operating expenses. Well, don't ask me how much 300,000 marks a month was in 1921. It may not have been actually a huge amount, but we have a little bit of discussion of that in the Zhivakov book. Oh, good Lord, someone is whistling. That drives me crazy. So, according to Zhivakov, and I should say, he's getting his information with respect to this meeting from Graf, from the man who was or would be the head of Kirill's chancellery, Georges Graf. Okay, so there was apparently a meeting to organize the financing of the Nazi Party and also the Russian dynasty. The proposed solution, the entry of a representative of Kirill to the financial committee of Aufbau and the payment of a contribution, was accepted by the Grand Duchess Victoria, who was allegedly at this meeting. During the plenary meeting, she confirmed her agreement to pay, like the other contributors, 500,000 marks, which was carried out the next day. Biskupsky was named Kirill's representative on the committee. So, yeah, I don't know. Until I get the Graf book myself, I can't really say more about this, except it seemed credible to Zhivakov, but he does say that the person that supplies this information is Graf. But it's interesting that, Dmitri mentioned this sum of 300,000 marks per month, and that there were some bankers behind it. And Zhivakov says that, that there were some financiers, some German financiers involved, and specifically that Grand Duchess Victoria was present at this meeting, not Kirill, but Victoria, and that she agreed to contribute 500,000 marks and to name Biskupsky as Kirill's representative on the Aufbau committee. So, I don't know. As I said before, to me, Biskupsky seems like a classic textbook psychopath. And psychopaths don't have any convictions one way or another. But anyway, just like what he's promising to Dmitri, he's telling Dmitri basically that he has spies everywhere. He has contacts within the Soviet government, he has contacts within the Red Army, so on and so forth. And he was telling other people that as well. He was telling other people that he had contacts here and there, and basically that he had spies everywhere. And what can you say about such a person? Dmitri doesn't immediately see through Markov, but he does pretty clearly see through Biskupsky. And in fact, later in the diaries, we will have him saying explicitly how much he dislikes Biskupsky, even though Biskupsky would continue to be connected to Grand Duke Kirill. All right, so Lecour talks about how this collaboration between the right-wing Russian émigrés and the early Nazi movement would come to an end fairly soon with the failure of Hitler's putsch in 1923. Kirill would be forced to leave Germany at some point, although I don't know why, and the Nazis would take an increasingly anti-Russian stance on racial grounds. Their so-called expert on race was a Baltic German who had been, a citizen or a subject of the Russian Tsar, Alfred Rosenberg. And he considered Russians to be another one of the subhuman races that ultimately needed to be gotten rid of. So you can see why that wouldn't work very well with the Russian émigrés, even the right-wingers, although some of them remained Nazis till the bitter end, one of which was Biskupsky. And I've probably said enough for today. All of this is very interesting. We're going to be, as I said, there's text talking about how Dmitri stuck to his principles, and we will be talking about that later, but I decided not to use that today because we're going to be going through all of this time in Berlin on a day-by-day basis, and then Dmitri can sort of put things in his own words, and we can hear what Graf says about Dmitri himself in relation to these groups. All right, well, I know I've forgotten something, but I guess I was intrigued by the fact that Biskupsky used the word, the white international, for this group that he wanted to form. So white, you understand, was not a racial term. It was a political term. It meant the white Russians were a sort of conglomeration of anybody a lot of them were monarchists, but also people like who'd been members of the Octoberist Party who were pretty much centrists, and they just wanted to see, you know, constitutional monarchists were also, or people who wanted a, you know, sort of a more or less liberal government, were also part of the White Russian movement, so not only monarchists. Okay, so I'll leave it at that. At least this time I didn't end up having to do an addendum. What was it that I wanted to say? About Biskupsky. Boy, I'll have to bring it up next time. All right, thanks for your patience. Bye.